This is Joe Biden. Black Lives Matter, period. I'm not afraid to say it.
As a country, we can't pretend that racism doesn't exist here. Anti-Black racism is real.
Making people still believe that they are oppressed or making people want to support organizations like Black Lives Matter, it's coming from the media, and it's especially coming from social media, where you have this culture online that's constantly telling people that you are a victim. It's systemically disempowering. It's essentially gaslighting Black Americans into thinking that we are less capable.
Alexa Lavoie for Ribbon News, and today I'm bringing you a special interview with a former Black Lives Matter activist. As you can see, in this new society, we've seen different movements emerge as Every Child Matters, Black Lives Matters, Trans Life Matters, and way more. But there is always two sides of the story, and today Xavier Durousseau is sharing his side of the story when he was in this movement as an activist, and today he's sharing the other side of the story when he accidentally red-pilled himself when he was supposed to take part of a show where he was supposed to convince people to begin to be a Black Lives Matter activist, as he was. So today he's sharing his story. Let's hear what he has to say to us.
Hello, I'm Xavier Durousseau. I'm a PragerU personality in Los Angeles, California, and my story starts with me being accidentally red-pilled. I used to be a BLM activist. I was one of those people who, for the longest time, felt like I had to root my entire identity in my skin color and in my race. It started when I was young, when I was born in Chicago, super predominantly Black area. There was a lot of crime there, and my eldest brother got into trouble. So once he got into trouble, my mom just was not having it. She talked to my dad and decided to move our entire family to the middle of nowhere cornfields in central Illinois. So that was a huge culture shock for my family, of course, going from a predominantly Black area to now being in this small cornfield town where we were one of the few Black families there. And because of that, I was always having my family members tell me that I needed to view everything from the lens of race. They would tell me things like how I would need to be careful of the quote unquote blue-eyed, red-headed devils. And there's a lot of far left people in my family, a lot of very liberal people in my family, and some of them can be pretty radical in their beliefs. But that being said, I was always being pushed into viewing everything through a lens of racism, which, looking back on it, a lot of what I was taught and the books I was given as a kid were CRT related, critical race theory.
A long time ago, way before you were born, a group of white people made up an idea called race. They sorted people by skin color and said that white people were better, smarter, prettier.
Where essentially you're looking critically into every single situation and finding racism out of it. So that continued as I got older, and I started to have this complex essentially, because being Black and living around predominantly white people, I would have people tell me that I would talk too white or I would act white. And then that would be when I was in Chicago, especially around my family members and around my friends out there. And then I would come back to Pontiac, and I would go back to Pontiac, Illinois, the predominantly white town I lived in. And that's where I would feel like I was too Black, or I couldn't trust the white people as much as I wanted to. And all of these people who actually loved me and cared about me, I was told not to trust them if their skin color was different from mine. So as I got older, I started to get more woke. Once I went to college, I became that much more woke. And I started being an activist around 2016 online, just posting different things about microaggressions and essentially, again, CRT things that I had been indoctrinated with for so long, where I wasn't as radical as my family members were per se, but I definitely found racism in many situations that had nothing to do with race, looking back on them. So then we get to about 2020. And at this point, I had been posting online, being a social justice warrior essentially for many years. And in 2020, that's when everything happened with George Floyd. Simultaneously, I had actually gotten bored during the pandemic, and I applied to be on this reality show. On that reality show, I was typecasted as someone who was going to be a BLM activist and teaching people how to be an ally of BLM. So the whole premise of the show was I was going to be woke on there, and my different competitors, because it was actually a game show, I was going to teach them how to be an ally. And in the process of that, I wanted to become as well versed on the different counter arguments as possible so that I could win more people over to my side. And in that process, I stumbled upon a Candace Owens video.
In many ways, were some of the people that were the closest to him. And I don't remember seeing your faces on the news or anybody talking to you. So I guess let's just start with that. You guys knew him best. So who was George Floyd?
She's right. We haven't told our side of the story. Maybe it's time for us to tell our story, you know?
That video completely just enraged me because she was right. She made a comment about George Floyd and how only in the Black community we take our lowest common denominator and make that the forefront of our community. And we lean into these things that are toxic to us and how we tend to be our own worst enemies in the Black community. So I was so mad about that. I decided to look deeper into her story, and I saw she was working with PragerU. So that led me on this whole rabbit trail, and I wanted to debunk PragerU, I wanted to debunk Candace Owens, and I was going to make an entire series doing so after I got off of the reality show. And in that process, I started to really look closely at BLM. I started to see the curtain come down because with the marches for George Floyd, I would go to these events and I would be so shocked seeing how so many people were just there for clout, or people were there just to pretend to be martyrs. I remember seeing people laying in the streets after chastising police officers, asking them to shoot them with rubber bullets, and would ask the police to fight them in any kind of way. And then as soon as they got hurt or something happened to them, they would have people taking photos of them and saying, wow, like this was a peaceful protest and this is what happened, making it seem like the police were the terrible, aggressive people in the situation when that wasn't the case. I also started to see the wall crumbling down when I would see the looting and the rioting. And I would talk to people about that at the events or online, the people who I would meet, and no one wanted to discuss it. No one wanted to talk about how it was predominantly Black areas that were being destroyed by these BLM riots. And no one even wanted to talk about how there were so many white Antifa members robbing Black businesses and saying that it was in the name of civil rights justice. And it showed me just how deeply indoctrinated so many of us were to the fact that we just allowed ourselves to be blinded by what was happening right in front of our eyes. So I kept pretty quiet about that as I continued to progress in this show. And I was just like, I have to find out more truth. Like I had to double down on my wokeness, because being at these events and seeing how close-minded people were within the BLM movement, I just knew I needed to be the person that was the most woke of all. And the deeper I dove, the more I was finding information that completely shattered the narrative I had been indoctrinated with. I would say one of the first big things for me was figuring out where the money going to BLM was actually being spent on. I learned it wasn't going to Black communities. It was not going to Black businesses. It wasn't even going to the quote unquote victims of police brutality. All of this money was going to pretty much progressive politicians, or it was going to other activism groups, particularly LGBT and the trans organizations that had nothing to do with the Black community.
Just how shady are the finances of BLM?
Just as shady as Joe Biden's son in Burisma. I mean, that's looking at the whole situation reminds me of that. They have a PAC. They're transferring money from one account, from one organization to another. Basically, it looks like they're funneling money to either their family members to possibly get it themselves, but the entire situation looks incredibly shady.
And not a single dollar to this day can be seen being spent in the Black community. And there were leaders at some of these events that I would go to when I would ask them, where's the money going? Like, are you receiving any funding? And they would try to be subtle about it, but they would give me this look of, we've been asking for the money, but we're not receiving any kind of funding. So this was something that even the organizers at BLM were recognizing that it was happening, but they wouldn't say anything about it because they didn't want to be kicked out of the movement, because it's very much this all in or all out pack mentality. So as I started to see the money isn't going to where it's supposed to be going, I asked myself, what else are they lying to me about? So then I started looking at the police brutality statistics, and I realized that police brutality is essentially a myth in the context that they're putting it in. Black people are not threatened by the police. Black people are being protected by the police. If anything, Black people so far have been the biggest threat to themselves, because Black on Black crime rates should be addressed long before we should be addressing what any other race or any specific occupation is doing to us. But no one wanted to discuss that. And over time, I just kept having this wall crumble down piece by piece, where I started looking at the truth of critical race theory, how all of this rhetoric was based on dividing us, and how they never really cared about Black lives. They just cared about Black votes. And all of this was a ploy to manipulate us through what Black America's Achilles heel is, which is fear. So by November of 2020, by October of 2020, it was days before I was supposed to fly out to London to film this reality show as a BLM activist, and I realized I just couldn't do it anymore. So I backed out of the show, and I spent a few months just trying to process all of this new information I had stumbled upon, and the fact that I had accidentally red-pilled myself, and I decided I had to speak out on what I had learned. So the first video I ever made, I reacted to a Candace Owens video, ironically, to make it full circle, and I was saying, before white supremacy or white nationalism, you can make a list of 100 things that are more relevant that we need to address in the Black community. And it started with father absence, and it was succeeded by illiteracy rates. I would say one of the biggest things making people still believe that they are oppressed, or making people want to support organizations like Black Lives Matter, it's coming from the media, and it's especially coming from social media, where you have this culture online that's constantly telling people that you are a victim. It's systemically disempowering. It's essentially gaslighting Black Americans into thinking that we are less capable. Because then when I push back and I ask questions like, what is it that a white person is allowed to do that as a Black person I can't do? There's nothing that they can tell me. Or they'll try to say, oh, white people can walk into a grocery store and not be harassed. I'm like, I'm not harassed. It depends on how you're dressed, or maybe how you're presenting yourself, or maybe the person's just doing their job. But there's just so many narratives that they try to push that when you take a step back and take your emotions out of it, it's just them being completely irrational. But I will say there are people who are on that side of things that are good-hearted people. They mean well. Because I always say my values didn't change. It was just my perspective on my values that I've realized I needed to reevaluate. Because I've always been pro-equality. I've always stood my ground on speaking out for what I believe in. And I've always wanted people to enjoy the privileges that you can have as an American. But the thing was back then, I was under this belief that I wasn't able to do all of those things already, or that I wasn't already enjoying equality. But then as soon as I changed my mindset, it's crazy how all of a sudden it feels like I took the shackles off of my own feet, because they were fictional in the first place. I've never been oppressed. I've never been a slave. But if you listen to so many people, especially woke people on the left, they are constantly telling Black people otherwise.
White people don't even realize that is white privilege. We can't even ride our bikes in the neighborhood without somebody harassing us simply for existing.
And when you come to Black kids at a young age, like the way that many came to me, it's hard to not have the mentality of being a victim. It's hard to learn about these different things like slavery and oppression from the lens of a woke person and not allow that to seep into your brain. When that's all you hear growing up, that you're a victim and that you never are going to have full rights, you believe that until you take a deeper dive into it. And I always say it's important for us to teach history. It's important to talk about Jim Crow and MLK and Malcolm X and everything that they went through. But when you do so, tell history the way that it actually played out. Tell history in a way that shows where we are now and how equal we are now. But the fact is we're not doing that. When we teach through the lens of critical race theory, we start to go backwards. And now in America, we're seeing so many college campuses segregating. They're having these multicultural centers that only ban white people, or they're having these Black only or Hispanic only graduation ceremonies. It's against everything that Martin Luther King stood for. Because why did we fight so hard to be in the same spaces and to be harmonious among the races, just to go backwards and try to make everything the way that it used to be? And one of the things that keeps Black people confused about it is not enough people recognize that there is a huge difference between what I call circumstantial racism and systemic racism. There are racist people out there. There are ignorant, immature, classless people out there. There always will be, and that comes from every race. Every race has people within their community that are racist.
If you like what we are doing and you want to see all of our show, as you know, at Rebel News, we have private show that you need to subscribe. So if you're interested, go to rebelnews.com, subscribe for the year, and you will have access to all our shows.